babies in to run around, hanging with the crowd, putting your business in the...
What if the smoothest voice in 1970s rock came from a Texas kid who got kicked out of prep school for refusing to cut his hair? He spent a decade as a journeyman before a single album sold over 5 million copies and rewrote what rock and roll could sound like. He toured with Steve Miller before either of them was famous. He recorded in Muscle Shoals when nobody knew his name.
Did my best, the perfect guest knew when to go.
Then at the absolute height of his powers, he simply stopped, walked away from the spotlight for nearly a decade, and opened a nightclub in San Francisco. This is the rise and fall of Boz Scaggs. William Royce Scaggs was born on June 8, 1944 in Canton, Ohio, but the family moved south before he had any memory of the place. He grew up in Oklahoma and Texas, shuttling between Plano and Dallas, absorbing the music that drifted out of every car radio and every roadhouse jukebox in the post-war South. His earliest musical memory was the sound of a Hank Williams record playing through a screen door on a humid Texas afternoon.
Nothing you can't handle, nothing you ain't got, but you're...
The longing in that voice, the way a single phrase could carry more weight than a whole sermon, planted something in him that never left. His father was a traveling salesman, a quiet man who valued discipline and propriety, and the young Boz was not particularly suited to either. By 12, he had picked up a guitar. By 14, he was sneaking out to hear black blues musicians play in clubs no white kid from his neighborhood was supposed to know existed. He listened to Bobby Blue Bland, Junior Parker, T-Bone Walker. He listened to the way those singers held a note like they were begging it to forgive them.
That old love life turning maybe 2 years. Same old...
That became his school. If you're loving these songs, hit subscribe and drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from, and which song still gives you chills? Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. He was sent to Saint to Entre Saint One Wordy. Marks a private boys' school in Dallas where he met a kid 2 years his senior named Steve Miller. Miller was already running his own band, The Marksmen, and Boz, who couldn't really play yet, lobbied his way in by sheer persistence. Miller eventually taught him chords on a back porch in Dallas, and the nickname Boz, short for a misheard pronunciation of his middle name during a school roll call, stuck for the rest of his life. The two of them became inseparable, bound by a shared obsession with records most of their classmates had never heard of. When Miller left Texas for the University of Wisconsin, Boz followed him there too. They played in a band called the Ardells, then the Fabulous Night Trains, working frat parties and dive bars in Madison while their classmates went to football games. But Boz was restless in a way that even Miller couldn't keep up with. By 1964, with the folk revival sweeping America and the British invasion changing everything overnight, he dropped out and bought a one-way ticket to Europe with almost no money in his pocket. What followed was one of the strangest apprenticeships in rock history. He busked in London. He hitchhiked through France. He played coffee houses in Sweden where his clean tenor and his American blues repertoire made him a minor curiosity. A small Swedish label gave him the chance to record his first solo album, simply titled Boz, in 1965. Almost nobody outside Stockholm heard it. He made enough to keep moving and not much else. By 1967, the call came from Steve Miller. San Francisco was exploding. The summer of love was happening.
He left the shack. Love that.
Miller had assembled the Steve Miller Band and needed a second guitarist and second voice he could trust. Boz flew home, joined the band, and within months was in London recording Children of the Future and Sailor, two albums that became cornerstones of the early San Francisco sound. His vocal on Dime a Dance Romance, all aching restraint and Texas blue notes, hinted at the kind of singer he was about to become. He stayed for 2 albums, then he left. The reasons were never fully explained, but everyone close to the situation understood. 2 strong voices, 2 strong personalities, 1 band. Miller wanted to be the leader. Boz wanted to be himself. They parted as friends, which by rock and roll standards was a small miracle. What happened next set the template for everything that followed. In 1969, Boz drove to Muscle Shoals, Alabama with a young Rolling Stone editor named Jan Wenner producing, and recorded a self-titled solo album with the legendary Muscle Shoals rhythm section. Duane Allman played guitar. The track Loan Me a Dime, a 13-minute blues epic that built from a whisper to a wail, became an underground classic that DJs played late at night when they wanted to clear the room of anyone who wasn't paying attention. The album sold poorly, almost nobody bought it, but every musician who heard it understood that something rare had walked into that studio in Alabama and walked out with proof. The next 6 years were the desert. Boz Scaggs released album after album through the early 1970s. Moments. Boz Scaggs and Band, My Time, Slow Dancer. Each one earned strong reviews from critics who recognized what he was doing. Each one sold modestly. He was, in the language of the industry, a critical favorite, which is a polite way of saying nobody was getting rich. He moved to San Francisco permanently. He played small clubs. He watched contemporaries he had outsung and outwritten move past him on the charts. Steve Miller, his old school friend, released The Joker in 1973 and became a household name. Meanwhile, Boz was opening for acts who had been opening for him just a few years earlier. Most artists in that situation do one of two things: they give up or they chase a trend. Boz did neither. He went the other direction entirely. He decided to make the most uncompromising, most carefully crafted record of his life, and he assembled a small group of session musicians in Los Angeles to help him do it. 3 of those musicians, drummer Jeff Porcaro, keyboardist David Paish, and bassist David Hungate, would the following year form a band called Toto. But before Toto existed, they were the rhythm section helping Boz Scaggs make the album that changed everything. Silk Degrees was released in February 1976. The first single, It's Over, did almost nothing. Columbia Records was about to write the whole project off. Then a Cleveland radio DJ flipped the record over and started playing the B-side, a song called Lowdown, with a bass line that walked into your living room and took off its coat. Within weeks, every R&B station in America was playing it. Then every pop station. Then every station period. Lowdown reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and won a Grammy for Best R&B Song. Lido Shuffle followed and climbed to number 11. We're All Alone, a ballad so gentle it felt like a held breath, became a standard the moment it was released. Eventually covered by everyone from Rita Coolidge to Frankie Valli, Silk Degrees stayed on the Billboard 200 for 115 weeks. Almost 2.5 years. It went platinum 5 times over. Worldwide sales eventually crossed 5 million. For a 31-year-old singer who had spent a decade being the guy critics liked but radio ignored, the speed of it was almost disorienting. He sold out theaters, then arenas, then he sold out the Greek Theater in Berkeley and the Universal Amphitheater in Los Angeles for multi-night runs. The man who had played Stockholm coffeehouses for tip money was now headlining venues he used to drive past on his way to gigs that paid $40 a night. The look came together at the same time as the sound. White suits, open collars, a tan that suggested he had time to live. He was photographed for magazine covers that had previously ignored him. The image, polished and calm and slightly amused by all the noise, became inseparable from the music. He was the cool one, the grown-up in the room, the singer who didn't need to shout. By 1977, Silk Degrees had outsold every other album in his catalog combined and then doubled it. He won that Grammy. He performed on national television. He toured Japan and Europe and Australia, where he had been completely unknown 2 years earlier and was now selling out concert halls. He was, finally and fully, a rock star, and almost immediately he started to retreat from it. The follow-up album, Down 2 Then Left, arrived in late 1977. It was a fine record. It was not Silk Degrees. The single Hard Times reached the lower end of the top 100 and stalled. The album sold a fraction of what its predecessor had. Critics who a year earlier had praised him as a genre-bending master now wrote about diminishing returns. Boz had seen this happen to other artists. He understood the pattern. The industry wanted Silk Degrees again, and again, and again, and the moment he stopped delivering, they would lose interest. He decided he wasn't going to be that kind of musician. He was going to make the records he wanted to make, and he was going to do it carefully, and if that meant disappearing for a while, then it meant disappearing for a while. In 1980, he released Middleman. The single Breakdown Dead Ahead became a top 20 hit. The album went platinum. It was, by most reasonable standards, a triumph. The track JoJo, a brooding character study about a Tijuana hustler, showcased a more cinematic, more adult sensibility. He contributed Look What You've Done to Me to the soundtrack of Urban Cowboy, the film that made country crossover a billion-dollar industry. Miss Sun became a top 20 single later that same year. Then he stopped. Not officially, there was no announcement, there was no farewell tour, there was no press release. Boz Scaggs simply stopped releasing albums. From 1980 to 1988, 8 full years, the man who had been one of the biggest acts in the world released nothing. The reasons were personal and they were entirely his own. He had a young son, he had a marriage that was reaching its end, he had spent 15 years on the road and he was tired in the specific way that only people who have lived out of a suitcase for 15 years can understand. He had also watched friends and contemporaries destroy themselves chasing the high of fame, and he had no interest in becoming another cautionary tale. He moved deeper into San Francisco. He bought a building in the Soma district and in 1985 opened a nightclub called Slim's, named after the bluesman Bumblebee Slim. The club became one of the most respected music venues on the West Coast, hosting everyone from John Lee Hooker to Prince. Boz himself would sometimes sit at the bar in the back, having a drink with friends, watching whoever was on stage that night. Most of the patrons had no idea the man in the corner had sold 5 million copies of an album they had probably danced to at their own wedding. He didn't think of himself as retired, he thought of himself as living a life. The distinction mattered to him. When he finally returned in 1988 with the album Other Roads, the music industry that welcomed him back was barely recognizable from the one he had stepped away from. MTV ruled everything. Synthesizers had eaten the world. The kind of carefully crafted, jazz-tinged adult R&B that had made Silk Degrees a phenomenon was now considered hopelessly out of fashion. Enjoying this musical video? Subscribe and turn on the bell. It's the only way to catch our next deep dive into the music you grew up with. The album underperformed. Boz didn't seem to mind. He had not made it to compete with Bon Jovi. He had made it because he had songs he wanted to record. The single Heart of Mine became a top 40 hit, which surprised him more than it surprised anyone else. The 1990s were when something interesting started to happen. Instead of chasing relevance, Boz did the opposite. He went deeper into the music he had loved as a teenager in Dallas, listening through the screen door. He recorded an album called Some Change in 1994 that leaned into adult contemporary songwriting. Then in 1997 he released Come On Home, a collection of blues and R&B standards. It was the kind of album that should have been a vanity project for an aging rock star. It wasn't. It was extraordinary. Critics who had written him off as a 70s relic suddenly noticed that his voice had aged into something even better than what it had been. The high tenor of Lowdown had developed bottom and shadow. He sang Sonny Boy Williamson and Jimmy Reed not as imitation but as completion, as a man who had earned the right to those songs through 40 years of listening to them. He toured with Donald Fagen of Steely Dan and Michael McDonald in a touring revue called The Dukes of September. The three of them, all roughly the same age, all veterans of the same era of carefully constructed adult music, played to audiences who had grown up with their records and now had grown children of their own. The shows weren't nostalgic exactly, they were something stranger and more affecting. They were a celebration of craft from a generation of musicians who had never stopped working at it. In 2003, he released But Beautiful, an album of jazz standards backed by a small acoustic combo. It debuted at #1 on the Billboard Jazz chart. He recorded another jazz standards album. He recorded a country-leaning album in Memphis. He recorded an album called Memphis in 2013 that climbed into the top 20 of the Billboard 200, his highest chart position in over 30 years. He was 68 years old. The pattern by then was clear, and it was the pattern of someone who had figured out something most rock stars never figure out. He had decoupled his sense of self from the size of his audience. He made the records he wanted to make. He toured when he wanted to tour. He came home when he wanted to come home. The career managed itself because he had stopped trying to manage it. The personal cost of those quiet years was real. He weathered the divorce. He weathered the kind of grief no parent should have to carry, including the loss of his oldest son. He didn't talk about any of it publicly, and he never wrote a tell-all album about any of it. and he didn't go on television to discuss any of it. He absorbed the losses the way Hank Williams had absorbed his, which was the way Boz had been listening since he was a kid in Texas. You sang around them, you let the song carry what you couldn't. By the 2010s, his concerts had taken on a quality that's hard to describe to anyone who wasn't in those rooms. The audiences were older, the lighting was simpler, the band was small and exquisite. He would sing Lowdown and Lido Shuffle and the crowd would sing every word. But the emotional center of the shows had shifted. The hits were gifts he gave the audience because they had paid for tickets and they deserved them. The real heart of the night was something quieter, a blues he had learned in 1962, a standard he had heard on a screen door in Plano, a song he had written about someone who was no longer alive to hear it. In 2018, at the age of 74, he released Out of the Blues, a record so musically assured and emotionally direct
Standing there, can't you see
that it felt like a summation. He toured behind it with a small band. The shows were sold out. The reviews were among the best of his career. He didn't promote the album with stunts. He didn't appear on talk shows. He just played the music for the people who showed up, and then he went home. Steve Miller, his old friend from St. Mark's, was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2016. Miller used his induction speech to lambaste the institution and the music industry generally, with a candor that became national news. Boz asked about it later, just smiled. He didn't have a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction. Many of his fans considered that an outrage. He didn't seem to consider it anything at all. The honors he did accept were small and chosen. He played at his nightclub Slim's a few times before it eventually closed in 2020. He performed with the San Francisco Symphony. He showed up at events for musicians he loved. He never campaigned for awards. He never gave the kind of interview where an artist tries to manage his own legacy. What was the legacy exactly? It was Lowdown on a car radio in the summer of 1976, the bass line walking into 1,000 bedrooms and changing what soul music sounded like for an entire generation. It was Lido Shuffle as the soundtrack to a million road trips, the kind of song that made you roll the window down whether the weather called for it or not. It was We're All Alone as the slow dance at the wedding, the breakup song, the late night drive home. It was the proof that an artist could sell 5 million records and still walk away from the machinery without burning anything down. It was a body of work that started in 1965 in Stockholm and ran through 2018 in California. 53 years of recorded music made by a man who never seemed to be in a hurry. It was the example, rare in rock and roll, of someone who understood that fame was a tool and not a destination, and that the work you did when nobody was watching was usually the work that mattered most. Boz Scaggs sold over 17 million records over the course of his career. Silk Degrees alone accounts for roughly a third of that. He produced one of the defining sounds of the late 1970s, helped launch the careers of 3 musicians who would form Toto, mentored a generation of Bay Area players, and built a venue that hosted some of the greatest live shows the West Coast saw in the 1980s and 90s. But the part that the rest of rock and roll couldn't quite figure out was the walking away. Not all the way away, never permanently, but enough to keep his life intact. He recorded when he had something to say. He toured when his voice was right and his band was ready. He raised a family. He buried people he loved. He drank coffee in his own neighborhood without anyone noticing. He didn't try to be 25 at 60. He let the years do their work, and he let his voice do its work. And the two things grew together. For the listeners who first heard Lowdown coming out of an AM radio in the back of a car in 1976, his story is not a tragedy and not a triumph. It's something rarer than either. It's the story of a musician who knew what he wanted from his life and built it carefully, decision by decision, year by year, until the life and the music became the same thing. The albums are still on the shelves. The songs still come on at restaurants and grocery stores and weddings. Lowdown still hits exactly the way it hit the first time. Lido Shuffle still makes drivers tap the steering wheel a little harder than the speed limit recommends. We're All Alone still does what it has always done, which is make a quiet room a little quieter. Boz Scaggs spent his whole career proving a single point. The work outlasts the spotlight. The voice outlasts the trends. The choices you make about what kind of life you want to live are more important than any chart position you'll ever earn. He never burned out. He never sold out the wrong way. He never embarrassed himself on a comeback tour or a reality show or a benefit concert. He just kept singing on his own schedule, on his own terms for as long as it felt right. That's not how most rock and roll stories end. That's how the best ones do. What's your Boz Scaggs memory? Was it Lowdown on the radio? Was it Lido Shuffle on a long drive? Was it We're All Alone at a wedding you still remember? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more of rock's greatest stories. Thanks for rewinding with us. If this hit the right note, check out the videos on screen now, and subscribe so you never miss another song from the golden age of music.